Hello, tubers. I'm going to talk to you guys about something that you may be running into a challenge on your bus. Some of you guys are trying to run a 40 horse engine in your bus. And, I'll tell you right now that they were pretty slow. But there are things to do to upgrade that. And I'm going to kind of go over those things if you want to run a 40 horse. Now, we're going to go back a little bit. I'm going to talk about 36s and buses and some of the things that were good about the 36 horsepower in the split case tranny in the bus. But in the 40 horse, it was kind of a weird era in buses. And we're going to talk about some of those things. A little bit has to do with the reason why you might see your fender wells being cut out in your bus. So in the early buses between around 1960 somewhere, 61 I guess is the official date, but I think they actually had some 40 horses in some of the early 60s, mid 60s, 1960 and up to 64. So I ran a 40 horse in my 57 bus. I had a full case trans in it. I ran that for years, and I'm going to tell you about the combinations that I had of gear ratios and engine mods that actually worked pretty well, and maybe you can try these things on yours. And also some of the earlier things in the early buses. So the thing to know is the early split case trans had a 0.79 fourth gear. The Bug full case transmission had a 0.89 fourth gear. So they're not a 1-to-1 ratio. Everything's in overdrive when you're talking about Volkswagens. So, and they ran the Bug, the typical late model Bugs ran 4.12, 412 gears, and the early ones ran 437 gears, 4.37. So on Bugs. And on buses, it was always a 4.12 in most years, except for, I don't know what the split case ones were. I think they were 412s too. But, so, anyway, and the gear reduction on the small nut trans was 1.39, and the big nut trans, which was 65 and later. So if your trans has a 46 millimeter nut on the wheel, then that's a big nut trans. If it's a 36 millimeter nut, which was the same as the Bugs, then that's a small nut tranny. So that's what we're talking about when I'm talking about these things. So you might want to look at those things in your bus if you're new to Volkswagens. So on the 36, on the early 36 horse and split case transmission with the 1.39 gear reduction boxes, they were running a 0.79 fourth gear. So with the 36 horse and a split case trans, the gear ratios on the freeway weren't as bad as even the later models. So if you had a 65, the gear ratio on the old 36 horse split case was actually better than on the late models. So if you have a early bus with a split case trans and you want to keep it original, you might want to just stay with that split case trans. I'm not going to tell you to put a split case trans in your later model bus, because the disadvantages of the first gear not being synchronized can be a pain in the ass, especially because you use first gear a lot in a bus. So anyway, but those gear ratios actually weren't too bad. And the only problem with them is you just didn't have enough power with the 36 horse to really push the gear ratios. So if you're running a 36 horse in your bus, you might want to look at those crankshaft upgrades that they have over it. They're really expensive, but those are the way to go for your 36 horse to give you more torque. But we're not going to talk about those right now. We're going to talk about the 40 horse. So the 40 horse mods to put on your bus So I kind of went around in a big circle, but I'm sorry about that, but I'm trying to keep straight here. The 40 horse mods for your bus, if you're going to run a 40 horse, the problems, I'm going to tell you real quick what the problems were with that, is in 61, they came out with the 60, 61-ish, they came out with the full case transmission in a bus. The official date was like 61, but I believe there were some that were out before then. So was the first years for the full case transmission. And the gear ratios in that were pretty terrible. So you had a small nut transmission, 1.39, and you had some of those had a 0.89 fourth. And if you have a 0.89 fourth and you have a small nut trans, I mean, what are you looking at, like 50 miles an hour on the freeway? I mean, it's just not going to be very good with that 40 horse. And if you do too much gear modification on a 40 horse, you're not going to have any power. So it's kind of a little bit of finessing game. But I'm trying to give you guys an idea of why you don't want to just run that stock trans. So a lot of people will just, go with whatever's in it. So, but I would do this. With the 40 horse, the best mods are a late model transmission, which would mean that you have a 64 and later gear ratios, or 65 and later gear ratios, which are 0.82 fourth gear and a big nut trans, a 1.26 gear ratio on your wheels. A 40 horse will pull those ratios okay if you do these mods. So what I would highly recommend, if you've got a 40 horse and you're going to run a 40 horse in your van, run these mods. So you want to put, first of all, if you're going to run 14-inch tires, you want to run the 205 75 14 tires. It makes a difference. If you run a 185 14, it's going to be a terrible gear ratio. Again, you're going to have the same problem. Or if you're running the 15-inch wheels, you're going to want to have something taller than a 165 15. So if you're running the 15-inch wheels, you might want to look up the circumference of the 205 75 14 and try and find a 15-inch tire that meets that same circumference that will actually fit on the van. I don't have those specs because I always ran 14s, even on my 57. Okay, so those are the sizes you want for your tires. And I could do 70 in my bus with a 40 horse. So it wasn't too bad. It was actually got around town pretty good, and it had the perfect gear ratios where it met up with the power just right. So the other things that I did to the engine, so I had those gear ratios in the transmission, and I had in my engine, I had the 1384 kit, which is the big bore kit for the 40 horse. You run the big bore kit, it's a slip-on cylinder, you don't have to machine anything to put them on. So if you've got a 40 horse that's all together right now and you don't want to split the case on it and rebuild the whole thing, you can just slip on some new cylinders, and while you're at it, put the 1600 rockers on the engine. So you're going to do a little bit of mods to make that work. You have to shim them and stuff like that, so you got to check into that. But I'm just giving you the numbers so you can figure it out. So if you're running the 40 horse and you're not going to rebuild it, you can do that and it'll be just fine. Now, if you're going to rebuild the engine, then you might want to go ahead at that point and upgrade the camshaft. And the reason you want to upgrade the cam in it, probably an angle 90, angle 100. I'm giving you, those are the kind of the cams that I would put in it. The reason you might want to upgrade that is you'll get two things. You're going to get more air flow through your heads. So if you have more air going through your heads, air and fuel mixture, even if it's too much for the engine, if it's over cammed, that can actually be okay because it'll help your engine run a little bit cooler. Okay. The other thing is it will also help the advance curve, so that when you're on the freeway and you're pushing those higher RPMs, 3,500 or 4,000 RPMs on the freeway to do some passing or whatever, that it's going to breathe a little bit better and it's going to run a little bit better with those higher RPMs. It's not going to fight you. The stock cam might kind of tops out, before that. So if you put the larger cam in, it'll help that. But when you put the camshaft in, if you're going to split the case, originally the 40 horse did not have cam bearings in, which is fine. You can run it without the cam bearings in it. It didn't have them originally, but when you're increasing the lift on your cam, now you're putting more stress on the case. So you should also put the cam bearings in. You can modify the case, open it up, put the cam bearings in. So those are just a couple things that you can do to your 40 horse. And like I said, on my 40 horse and my bus, it wasn't the fastest thing in the world, but if I floored it and kept it on the floor for a little while, it would pick up to about 70 or so, which is pretty fast for a bus with a 40 horse. And that's because I had those tires, I had those gears ratios, and I had all that stuff on it. If you run the original stuff, you're probably not going to be very happy when you get it done. It's not going to go very fast. You're going to have people, on your back bumper when you're driving. You're increasing your risk of accident. Somebody might rear end you because you don't go fast enough down the road. It's why it's important to get this stuff right. So that's just a couple things that I've done in mine and things that I know that have worked for me. If you want to try it at your own risk, of course. Of course, because sometimes a 40 horse is a lot cheaper to put together than the 1600 because maybe you just don't have one, and you're trying to look original when you open the hood. Everything will look completely original if you do that. You can keep the same stock 28 millimeter carburetor if you want. I'd go to the 30 since you're doing the upgrade, but you can keep the 28 or the 30 millimeter carburetor. It looks pretty much original from the outside, but it'll drive a whole lot better and it'll pick up speed a whole lot faster than the original 40 horse. Because it was just kind of a weird thing. Those years, 60 to 64, kind of had some funky bus gear ratios. I mean, they, in the late 60s when they came out with the big nut, it was a lot better. Still not as good as I would want it today. I would definitely, on the later models, you can go with the 344 gears and it's a lot better. But on the early, if you're running a 40 horse, you're not going to be able to push a 344. It just doesn't have enough power. So anyway, that's the way to do it. If you're going to do it, you're going to run a little higher RPM down the road. It's going to be a little noisier when you're driving down the road, but it actually is a good compromise that's halfway in the middle. So I'll talk to you in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe.